Hi, my name is Cindy, and I go by the handle the So. I am a fashion designer and sewing pattern designer. I make sewing patterns for home sewists. And today I am going to walk you through a tutorial on how to make my sewing pattern, the Bog Jacket. The Bog Jacket is an over 2,000-year-old concept, and what I've done is take the old traditional design and I've modernized it and I've added different features and a little more shape to the arms. Some of these features include a hood expansion pack, a button, using the neck as a pocket. In 2022, I released the original Bog Jacket sewing pattern. This sewing pattern did not include a hood. So for this design, it was basically just a bias binding neck. And you can see here the pattern. This is a different version. I have a waist belt. And then I have an option to do a square pocket instead of the neck patch pocket. Fast forward to 2025, I just released a hood expansion for the sewing pattern. So this pattern comes separately, but it offers you a way to use the original pattern with adding a hood. So in this tutorial, I will be walking you through how to use the expansion pack with the existing pattern. And I also have a bundle in my Etsy shop where you can actually buy both patterns at the same time. Fabrics I recommend for this would be more on the rigid side, and it can really be any thickness. You can go a lighter weight denim, or in this case, I thrifted a Pottery Barn blanket and it's really thick. So the thicker the fabric might be a little trickier to sew some of the details, but it is possible. The other materials you're going to need is a lot of bias binding, which in the sewing pattern, I walk you through how much you need. I also have a tutorial for how to make your own bias binding. At the beginning of the sewing pattern, I walk you through how to do it, but then I also have another YouTube video that shows you, so I will link that below. For this design, I bought pre-made bias binding. The Bog Jacket is a zero to low waist design, and I like to call it more low waist because there's a lot of trimming and there is some waist, so this is probably more of a low waist design. Now this sewing pattern is paperless, meaning there is not printable paper template for the main bodice. Now the hood does have a print pattern and the neck opening has a print pattern, but the way that a low waist design works, because it's mostly rectilinear and triangles, the pattern tends to be a template base. This is a paperless sewing pattern, meaning a template is provided to you with dimensions and the template, and then you take those dimensions and you draw them directly onto your fabric piece. I will walk you through how to do that. This is a bit unconventional, but if you're familiar with zero and low waist sewing patterns, this is the standard. It's in efforts to reduce waste, but it also makes sense when you're creating like more rectilinear or angular designs. As a sewing pattern designer, I have multiple sewing patterns available in my Etsy shop and my Shopify. I will link that below. Currently, this is my second tutorial. I also have a Bog tutorial for the T version of the jacket, which I did release prior to the jacket. Similar construction, but it just offers you a T version. Feel free to leave a comment or respond to this tutorial. If you need any follow-up, happy to answer questions. I can be emailed at cindy@sosodesign.com. And I look forward to hearing your feedback and what you think. And I hope this tutorial is really helpful and encourages you to try to make something different. Page 1 of the sewing pattern is the intro page, but also shows you 3 different view options. Moving on, we next have a description, difficulty, and process page, and this just walks you through the history of the bog, the difficulty level, and just the process of how this sewing pattern works. Moving on, we show the views. We have view A, which is cropped, and view B, long. We have a sans closure, a bias tie closure, and a button closure. Now, if you're wanting to add the hood, here is the Bog Jacket hood expansion pack. Again, this is sold separate from the original sewing pattern. Similar to the Bog Jacket, this also has description and difficulty level. And here we have the view A and view B options with the hood. One of my biggest pieces of advice for this sewing pattern is to read the instruction booklet start to finish before proceeding. In the pattern itself, I have diagrams that break down an understanding of the Bog Jacket and the concept. It's important to understand these before completing the project. I also provide a fabric size cut worksheet, and you can just go this step by step, and this will give you the amounts of fabric and bias tape based off of your design selection. Once the worksheet's complete, you can then select your template. Now on the left side, we have the original Bog Jacket template, and then on the right side, we have it with the hood. So just make sure that whatever direction you select, you're working from the correct template and the correct length. For the next step, you will need your correct fabric size as well as your neck opening, and then if you're going to do the hood, locate that template now. Cut your fabric piece down to the fabric requirement size indicated on your worksheet. Again, this is going to be based off your size and design option, as well as if you're doing a hood or not. When cutting your fabric, we want it to be perfectly rectangle, paying attention to the grain line and the width and the length. Lay your rectangle fabric piece right side up, making sure the grain line is in the correct direction. Fold the piece of fabric at the center fold with right sides together. Using a chalk or disappearing fabric pen, measure and draw the template onto the fabric. It is recommended to draw the guidelines as well to ensure the notches line up, and you're going to transfer all notches to both sides. Pay special attention to the cutting lines and the guidelines. The guidelines are shown in dashed lines. You do not want to cut these. I also recommend starting with the outside dimensions, working your way in. Next, you'll take your neck opening and you'll place it on the fabric according to the template layout. Be sure to pay attention to front versus back. Draw the neck opening onto the fabric. If you are doing the hood, now's the time to lay out the hood and place the hood where it's indicated on the template. Once you have everything drawn onto the fabric, I highly recommend to measure twice and cut once. So now is a good time to test all of your measurements and make sure they're correct. You can now cut out the template along the cut lines. Again, do not cut guidelines. For this sample, the fabric is really thick, so I actually had to cut it out a single layer at a time. And once it's all cut, you can do a quick test and fold it all up and see how it comes together. I provide instructions on how to make continuous double bias binding. I do have another video that I will link below. For this sample, I did not make my own bias. The patch pocket is optional. You can either take a rectangular piece or the neck opening. For this sample, I will be making the neck opening into a patch pocket. Cut the bias binding per the lengths indicated in the sewing pattern. Again, this is 3/8 inch double folded. Place the bias binding on the pocket, right side of bias facing wrong side of pocket. Align the raw edge of the bias to the raw edge of the pocket. At the beginning, fold the end of the bias in 1/2 inch wrong sides facing. Pin bias in place. Continue pinning the bias to the pocket, making sure the edges of bias binding and pocket are aligned. At the end, overlap the edge of the bias binding by 1/2 inch over the folded edge. Keep all edges aligned, pin in place. Sew along the first fold of the bias binding all the way around, 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure the fold at the overlap is aligned and tucked in prior to stitching. Flip the bias binding outward towards the right side of pocket, press seam allowance and bias tape out if needed. Trim the seam allowance down to make sure that the bias can wrap over the seam allowance, and then make sure the bias edge is folded in. Place pocket right side facing up. The folded edge of the bias should encase the seam allowance and barely cover the row of stitching from step A. Pin in place and sew the bias binding down, stitching a 1/16 inch from the edge of the bias tape. Press the pocket and set aside for later steps. Section 3 walks you through if you wanted to make a square pocket, but we will not be doing that for this tutorial. For this tutorial, I'll be doing the hood expansion. I'll be starting with the BOG Jacket instructions from the original design and then incorporating the hood expansion pack as we go. Section 4, we start with the bodice horizontal or underarm bias bound seam. This is actually the hardest part of the project, so if you can get through this part, you are home free. For my sample, I actually have a pretty thick fabric, so you'll see a lot of difficulty, but again, it can be done. It's just a little challenging. The horizontal bias can go on the inside or the outside of the garment. For this sample, I'm going to put it on the outside of the garment. For this next step, you do want to pay attention to all your guidelines because that will help you do the correct folds in the correct directions, and also pay attention to the diagram A. Place the bodice flat, wrong side facing up. Fold top edge of sleeve bodice forward at shoulder seam towards the underarm and horizontal seam. Fold the bottom portion of the center front edges inward at the side fold lines. All the center front edges should align with the wrong sides facing. If you look at detail 1, I show a small clip happening at the corner where the bodice meets the back sleeve. I don't necessarily think this is a critical move unless you have very rigid fabric, but if you have very loose fabric, if it's quilted fabric, sometimes it can provide too much stretch. So I would start that clip really small and then make it larger if you need to. Flip the top part of the bog towards the back at the underarm seams. Right sides will be facing. Align the center front notch with the center front seam and pin. Align sleeve edges and pin. Starting at the center front, work your way towards the angled clip if you did this, and pin the seam edges together, making sure that all edges are even. After you reach the clip will expand as you pin the two edges together. There will be some excess fabric between the clip and the sleeve edge. Ease this fabric and pin in place. Baste the edges together. Be sure that your stitch is past the clip line as shown in detail 2. Repeat for both sleeves. Cut the bias tape per the indicated length. The bias should be the 3/8 inch double folded tape. Again, verify the length with the bodice before attaching. Place the bodice flat and flip the top part towards the back at the underarm seams, right sides facing. Bottom portion of the bodice is facing up. Starting at the center front, open the bias tape and place the double fold bias so that the edge hangs over the center front about a 1/2 inch. Align the raw edge of the bias with the basted seam raw edge. Right side of the bias will be facing the right side of the bodice. Pin in place and sew together along the first fold. You can remove the basted thread after this seam. Flip the bias binding outward towards the top portion of the bodice. Trim the seam allowance as needed. This fabric is really thick, so I needed to trim quite a bit. You want to make sure that the bias edge is folded in, and then making sure that the seam allowance is tucked in nicely with the fold. The folded edge of the bias should encase the seam allowance and barely cover the first row of stitching from step A. Pin in place and sew the bias down 1/16 of an inch from the folded edge of the bias. Press the finished bias binding flat towards the bottom of the bias. Stitch the bottom edge of the bias binding to the bodice 1/16 inch from the folded edge of the bias. The bias binding will lay flat on the exterior side of the bodice. Even though the instructions are somewhat simplified, this will be the most difficult part of this project. My fabric is relatively thick, so you'll notice that there's a little bit of a struggle to get it all the way to the sleeve hem. I start at the center front and I basically stitch the bias down as far as I can go. I try to push the sleeve underneath while separating the fabric and getting your hand in there, and I can only go so far. So for this one, I stopped it when I hit a point where I couldn't sew anymore, and then I flipped it around and started at the sleeve hem and worked my way back to the stitch. You'll do this for both sides. If you are doing the hood expansion, now's the time to assemble your hood. This will be section 5 in the Bog Jacket hood expansion pattern. With wrong side facing, baste hood together along the curve with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting at the hood opening and ending at the center back. You can clip the curve if you need to. For this hood, I tried using my serger instead of basting, and it didn't really work out so well. So moving forward, I will not be using the serger. Cut the bias tape per lengths indicated in pattern. Position hood so right side faces out and lay the hood flat. Place the double fold bias binding along the edge of the seam allowance with right side of bias facing right side of hood. Pin in place. The raw edge of the bias should align with the raw edge of the hood. Sew along the first fold of the bias. The seam allowance will be about 3/8 inch. Backstitch at the end to hold the bias in place. The basted seam should be concealed in the new seam allowance. Flip bias binding outward towards the other side of the hood. Trim the seam allowance as needed and fold the bias binding over the seam allowance. Make sure the bias raw edge is folded in. With right side facing out, the folded edge of the bias should encase the seam allowance and barely cover the row of stitches from step A. Pin in place and sew the bias binding down, stitching 1/4 inch from the folded edge of the bias. Press the bias binding flat along the curve of the hood toward the other side of the hood. Stitch the bias binding down 1/16 inch from the folded edge of bias. The bias binding will lie flat along the center line of the hood. Place the hood on the bodice along the neckline, wrong sides facing. The raw edge of the hood will match up with the raw edge of the neck opening. Align the center back and the center fronts and ease the hood between the center back and center fronts and pin in place. Baste the hood and bodice together with a 1/4 inch seam. Next, we will be adding bias to the neck opening. Cut the bias down to the lengths indicated in the pattern. Lay the bodice flat, right side facing out. Tuck the hood inside so that the wrong side of the hood is facing the wrong side of the bodice. Place the double fold bias binding on the neck opening with right side of bias facing right side of bodice. Align the center of the tape with the center back of bodice and hood. Pin in place. The raw edges should align. Pin all the way to the center front. There should be a little bit of overhang from the bias at the center fronts. Sew along the first fold of the bias, which is about 3/8 inch in. Be sure to backstitch at the start and the finish to keep the bias in place. Flip bias binding outward towards the hood side of the bodice. Trim the seam allowance as needed. The folded edge of the double bias should encase the seam allowance and barely cover the first row of stitches from step A. Pin in place and sew the bias down a 1/16 inch from the folded edge of the bias tape. Make sure to backstitch at the center fronts to encase the folded bias tape. Press the finished bias binding flat along the curve of the neck opening, towards the hood. Stitch the bias down to the hood 1/16 inch from the folded edge. The bias binding will lie flat along the neck opening and the hood. Section 8 is center, front, and hood bias binding. For this sample, I'm doing a button closure. If you plan to do the tie closure, refer back to the original BOG jacket and complete that section. Then return to this section. Lay your bodice flat, turn inside out so the wrong side faces out. Cut the bias per the lengths indicated in the pattern. Verify the length with the bodice and hood. Place the double fold bias binding so the raw edge is aligned with the raw edge of the center front and the edge of the hood. Right sides of bias will be facing the wrong side of the bodice and hood. Pin in place and sew together along the first fold, about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Flip the bias binding outward towards the right side of the bodice. Trim the seam allowance as needed and fold the bias binding over the seam allowance, making sure the raw edge of the bias is folded in. With right sides facing out, the folded edge of the bias will encase the seam allowance and cover the first row of stitching from step A. Pin in place and sew the bias binding down, stitching a 1/4 inch from the folded edge. At this point, the hood is completed and you can revert back to the original BOG jacket instruction booklet for the remainder of instructions. Section 7 in the original BOG jacket will walk you through how to do the neck opening if you are not doing the hood. The instructions will be same for the bottom hem. For this sample, I am going to walk you through the instructions for the bottom hem, but again, you will use the same instructions for the neck opening. Cut the bottom hem bias tape length per the instructions, and if you need the neck opening, cut that as well. Lay the bodice flat, turning inside out so that the wrong side of the bodice faces out. Place the double fold bias binding on the opening with right side of bias facing wrong side of bodice. Pin the raw edge of the bias with the raw edge of the opening. As you work your way around to the center front, there will be about a 1/2 inch overhang on both sides. Sew along the first fold of the bias to the bodice. The seam allowance will be about 3/8 inch. Backstitch at the center front edges. There should be a 1/2 inch overhang at both edges. Before wrapping the bias binding over the seam allowance, fold the 1/2 inch overhanging raw edge in so the fold aligns with the bodice center front. Continue folding the bias tape over the seam allowance, making sure the folded end is tucked in. Pin this in place. The folded edge of the double bias will encase the seam allowance, covering that first row of stitches from step A. Pin in place and sew the bias down 1/16 inch from the folded edge. Make sure to backstitch at the center fronts and encase the folded bias tape edge. You will repeat this again for the neck opening and the bottom hem. Section 8 of the original BOG Jacket instructions show you how to do the sleeve bias binding. Starting at the sleeve bias binding seam, place the double fold bias binding on the sleeve opening, right side of the bias facing wrong side of the sleeve. Align the raw edge of the bias to the raw edge of the opening. Fold the starting of the bias in a 1/2 inch with the wrong side facing. The fold should fall just below the bias seam. Pin the bias in place. Pin the bias around the sleeve opening, making sure the edges are all aligned. At the end, overlap the edge of the bias binding by a 1/2 inch over the folded edge. Keep all edges aligned, pin in place. Sew along the first fold of the bias 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure the fold at the overlap is aligned and tucked in prior to stitching. Flip bias binding outward towards right side of bodice. Trim seam allowance as needed and wrap the bias over the seam allowance, making sure the bias edge is folded in. With right side facing up, the folded edge of the bias will encase the seam allowance, covering the first row of stitches from step A. Pin in place and stitch 1/16 inch from the edge of the bias tape. Complete for both sleeves. For this sample, we are doing the button closure. Locate the button openings per section 9 instructions. For this sample, I attached the pocket before the buttons. You can do it either way. I recommend testing the button opening before proceeding on the actual bodice. Once you complete the button openings, I open them and then I add fray check. Locate the buttons. I like to align all of the seam edges and then I overlap the opening with the other side and I basically just mark where I want my button to go. I prefer to locate the buttons closer to the edge of the jacket. Attach your buttons. I like to put fray check on the backside to secure. Section 10 is the waist tie closure. Complete these instructions now. If you are not doing section 10, move on to section 11, pocket attachment. Place your jacket bodice right side facing out with the front facing up. Place the pocket wrong side of pocket facing right side of your bodice. I show guidelines in the sewing pattern. I think you can follow these. However, do attach it to personal preference. Pin the pocket in place to the bodice. Sew the pocket to the bodice along the outside folded edge of the bias, starting and stopping at the indicated recommendations in the sewing pattern. And that is it. You now have a bog jacket with a hood or without a hood. Be sure to follow me for more tutorials. I'm starting to release these regularly. Also be sure to tag me at the so and hashtag my bog make.